I'm Julian Rogers in Kingston, Jamaica, and welcome to Caribbean Bridges. Well, this could really be described as the season of disasters. First, volcano in St. Vincent, affecting not just that country, but neighboring territories as well with the ash fall, and forcing thousands into shelters out of the red and orange zones. In Guyana, flooded out. Yes, not a sexy story, one of my Guyanese friends says, like the hurricanes and the volcanoes. So we determined to give you a sense of what's been happening there. As well, we look at this matter of building back better. What's it meant for Dominica, for instance? And also, whenever all these disasters hit the Caribbean, there's always an international response. And we get a chance to talk to one of the organizations that has done just that. So first, let me talk to a man called Don Corriet. He is in Dominica. He's a former head of their disaster management agency there. He's now a consultant making pepper sauce. I don't know how you make that combination, but I admire his work as the leader of communicating the mitigation in the wake of Erica and much more in Dominica. So he joins us from Roseau today. Welcome to you, Don.
Thank you, Julian, and I'm very happy to share my experience with your audience. Looking forward also to hearing from Guyana. I understand it's an unfolding event.
It certainly is a very serious situation over there.
Okay,
and
so
I have to say that though you may look like you've been in a crash, that I hope that people understand that you had a fall and therefore you're recovering. So we're very happy you'll join us.
It's all part of resilience.
Yes, there you go, proving it one more time. And as I talk about resilience and relief, I'm very happy to welcome Regis Chapman, who is head of the World Food Program Office for the Caribbean. He's based in Barbados. He joins us from Bridgetown. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Julian. Very good to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. A little later on, we'll get a chance to look at what's happening in Guyana. As I said, flooded out all the regions there affected from Georgetown all across the country, literally. And a lot of the pictures that we've seen, of course, of people using boats to get around, the civil defense people, very busy trying to come to the rescue with food packages and much more. So there's a lot going on in Guyana, and I trust that Caribbean people will respond to any appeal coming from Guyana at this time. Let me start first, though, with Don Corriet in Rosa Dominica. I mean, it's several years now since Erica and all these disasters that have hit Dominica in this period. But I want you to talk about you, first of all, and I always do this with my guests, get a sense of how you got into the business of disaster management in the first place, Don.
Okay, I am a 38-year-old veteran of the public service. I started up as an air traffic controller and in the airport services, then went up the ladder to assistant manager, then to manager. And in 2008, I made the transition from the airport after 27 years to disaster management. I was a program officer at that office for 4 years before I went into the post, or was invited into the post of coordinator acting after the resignation of the coordinator at the time. So I went into disaster management as a posting from the airport to the disaster office. I remained at the disaster office until 2015, 2016. And then again, I was posted to the Ministry of Telecommunications within the Ministry of Public Works. So that's my brief history as a public officer. My engagement in disaster management came from the fact that I was exposed to many programs and many courses in emergency management at the airport, at the aviation level. So I attended many emergency management courses that involve planning, that involve management, response, mitigation, at the airport, at the civil aviation level, which has very high standards. So the transition for me was not very difficult going into the disaster management coordination role.
When did Erica hit as far as that career path was concerned?
Erica hit in 2015. Prior to that, Dominica had experience like Guyana, well, on a much smaller scale, but a number of events over a 10-year period, climaxing, as it were, well, not climaxing, but the most recent being Hurricane Maria in 2017, which was a catastrophic event. But from 2007, while I was still at the airport, we had Hurricane Dean. 2 years later, we had Hurricane Omar. 2 years later, we had the collapse of the Mathieu Dam, the famous Mathieu Dam in the Layo Valley area. And then we had the 2013 December trough system that devastated parts of St. Vincent, St. Lucia, and also Dominica, followed by Erica in 2015 and Maria in 2017. So it almost looked like in a 2-year sequence, Dominica was being hit by some kind of hydromet system. And so that allowed me to become a little bit seasoned in the response and mitigation as well, more the response, because most of the events, for example, the trough system, Tropical Storm Erica, were events that were not forecasted to hit Dominica. And so it was like a surprise element to us. So we had to jump into response mode and manage that situation as it were.
Now, no one is ever prepared in real terms for a hurricane. What would you say?
Preparedness does not stop. Preparedness does not stop. You know,
yes.
you always have to be in a mood of preparedness. You always have to be tweaking. You always have to be modifying your plans, and that's what it's all about.
So that you, as an agency, would have been preparing, yes, and it's an ongoing process. But how do you deal with the general public and their, I don't know, sometimes it's casual, sometimes there's a sense of urgency. If an event has been in recent memory as opposed to long distant memory, so to speak, isn't that the biggest challenge?
Yes, and our culture in the Caribbean is such that we only take things seriously when the events are upon us or is about to hit us. So I say that, for example, during peacetime, one for a better word, when we have our programs, we find the response and the participation to be a little lackluster. But if there is an event, a potential event to strike, you find the hype is there. But what we want to do is to change that mindset, to change that culture, and to begin to sensitize from the grassroots level, community level, to even the executive, because even at the executive level, in peacetime, there seems not to be an urgency to put things in place that would mitigate, so to speak, against a future impact. So we let down, for a better term, we let down sometimes our guard too easily. And that is a challenge for disaster management, not only in Dominica, but throughout the Caribbean. And example, we had Maria, we had far back as Hurricane David, that although the warning systems were there, but the populace was still a little lackadaisical in their response to the preparation. As soon as the storm strikes or the event strike, I must say the response for recovery or to rehabilitate is tremendous. People get together, they do things together. But we want that same level of energy to transform into the preparedness and to the mitigation side.
We can come back and talk to you a lot more about that and what has happened ever since then. Well, let me bring in Regis Chapman here from the World Food Program Office for the Caribbean, based in Barbados. Regis, I want to ask you the same question I asked of Don. How did you get into this business in the first place?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think more by circumstance rather than anything else. I had grown up in the United States. I went overseas when I was rather young, and was working in rural El Salvador when Hurricane Mitch hit in 1998. So I was literally thrown into disaster response without having planned for it. So I was working in development and supporting rural communities, and that obviously quickly changed. And that experience sort of drove me a bit after I saw, the impact that these events have on people. And you grow up seeing that on the news and on TV, but it's not the same as when you see it in real life. So after that, I started working with the Red Cross for a few years, and for the last now 16 years, I've been working with the World Food Program in a variety of contexts, from like shocks like hurricanes to conflict zones to long-term food insecurity issues and a number of difficult contexts. And now in the Caribbean, focused really on helping to strengthen emergency preparedness, emergency readiness, and emergency response capacities within the region.
I was looking, Regis, at the video produced by World Food Program, where you got the Peace Award for your work around the world. I was struck by the contrast, I think, between those pictures and our situation in the region. How similar or dissimilar is the relief program in the region?
So the work the World Food Program is doing in the Caribbean is really quite innovative. We're the largest humanitarian organization around the world, and we also use food assistance and our technical expertise in development settings to help change lives as well. Our work in the Caribbean, for the most part, during peace times, as Don had said, is really about strengthening capacities and bringing in the expertise that WFP has on the global stage, and really trying to contextualize that here in the Caribbean with our partnership with the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, or SEDEMA, as well as many of the national governments around the region. So our work is really quite different. But of course, then we have hurricanes, and we have volcanoes, or we have the flooding in Guyana, and oftentimes these significant events are above the capacity of any country on their own, and again, occasionally above the capacity of the region as a whole. So when called upon, we sort of shift into response mode, and again, work quite closely with SEDEMA, quite closely with the affected states, and try to embed our capacities within nationally led responses. So again, the video that you will have seen, it's context where the World Food Program really takes on the primary role of delivering food and other assistance in times of shocks. Whereas our approach in the Caribbean is very different. So right now, in St. Vincent, after the volcanic eruption of La Soufriere, we've essentially embedded our logistics capacity within the NEMO-led response, and in coordination with SEDEMA and the Caribbean Disaster Response Unit. So we've brought in a number of supplies and equipment that we had pre-positioned in Barbados and in other parts of the region, to really help to manage the inflow of relief items, and to help make sure that delivery to those who are impacted is effective and efficient. At the same time, we are bringing in some direct assistance to people who are impacted. So we're working quite closely with the Ministry of National Mobilization to provide cash transfers to people who are impacted. But really, it's about embedding these capacities and the tools and assets or resources that we can bring, and embedding that within these government responses, rather than a parallel WFP response, which you might see in other parts of the world.
Which brings me to the experience that I really watched Don Coriat in the mitigation exercise as far as Erica was concerned. I was particularly struck by the partnership which you just described, Regis, between the international relief agencies and the Dominica agencies. Don, would you speak to that? And what was, I mean, you were right in the middle of it and leading it, etc. Was my perspective correct?
Yes, in fact, it is. And as was said earlier, the regional response mechanism led by SIDEMA, played a pivotal role in us getting that assistance formalized and up and running smoothly. Without SIDEMA, I think on our own, we would not be able to do that. So congratulations to SIDEMA King. I think that system works. And it was almost a smooth transition in getting the aid and the coordination going from those states. As rightly said, every state, every participating state on their own do not necessarily have the capacity, both in terms of human resource and logistics and equipment to respond to such hazard or disasters, which are on a large scale. For example, Erica, there was need for air surveillance and air rescue that we didn't have that capacity. And through CDMA, we were able to get, first of all, the Trinidad and Tobago, the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago to respond with helicopters. And then we tapped into the French and to the British, all as a result of the CDMA mechanism. I want to go on record personally, and probably I can safely say on behalf of the government and the people of Dominica, although I'm no longer a public officer and I'm not in an executive position, but to really thank the World Food Program for a fantastic job they did post Maria. I think that went down very, very well. I think they have to be commended for the job. Well done.
Regis, you take a bow.
Yeah, thank you, Don. I mean, hearing that coming from you, and when it comes from our government counterparts around the region, I mean that's there's no greater greater flattery than that. So I mean, it's obviously what we're here to do, and we're here to support governments around the Caribbean. That's our job, and we take pride in our job. And to hear, not everyone's perfect, and we make mistakes along the way as well. But it's always great to hear such words from our counterparts around the region.
Don, speaking of mistakes, let's zero in on what we do wrong and what we should be doing right. You've had enough experience now in this matter. Let's lay it out for the public to better understand how they should respond, what agencies should be doing what, where, etc.
Okay, I think what drives our gaps, well, not drives our gaps, but what exposes our gaps most of all is, I think, the legislative framework. We still do not have the adequate legislative framework that can guide us in the preparation and mitigation and response. I say that to say that, for example, the Office of Disaster Management up till now does not have the legal authority to do most of the things that it would want to do. The second gap in terms of our shortfalls is the capacity at the office. I think the office needs to be strengthened. We need more technical staff there. We need more equipment. We need more emphasis placed on early warning systems, for example. That is a gap that keeps showing itself as a shortcoming, as a negative, because on the onset of a event, there's always a problem to get communications right. There's always the shortfall of manpower, trained manpower. So the dynamics of getting into the disaster management still needs to be strengthened, and it has to be strengthened from executive policy level. And without the legislative framework, the institutional framework, and we continue to get negative impacts in our preparation and response, because we lack the teeth, or we lack the authority to do certain things that we want to do.
What are those things, Don?
And it goes in combination with other institutions. For example, land use planning, zoning, respecting of waterways and building close to shorelines that can impact when you have a storm surge. The informal building culture and those kind of things. So we need to strengthen our legislative framework. Excuse me. We also need to put in place a disaster relief fund so that we can contribute to that fund that would allow us to do certain things that we want to do pre and post event. That too is lacking. And we can understand in small island states like Dominica, for example, and the rest of the Caribbean, budgetary constraints are real. Resources are scarce. Priorities are always overwhelmed. Everything is a priority in our islands. So competing for the disaster dollar or the development dollar for disaster mitigation and preparedness sometimes is not always forthcoming. On the aspect of our I wouldn't want to say negative response to events, but we still do not have a culture of preparedness. We still do not have a culture of mitigation to a great extent. And as I spoke earlier on, we need to continue our community education programs to get people sensitized and to have disaster mitigation and disaster management instilled into the community at the domestic level, at the home level, at the individual level. And I must make reference there to CDEMA, the Caribbean disaster, the Caribbean, the CDM program, right?
Yeah.
Which was intended to be mainstream for every development sector in the island. So be it tourism, be it agriculture, be it sports, be it education, also in the private sector and the civic society, churches, and all the other institutions. So we will have a change of mindset, a change of culture that would allow for all the negatives that we see coming out from an impact. People will be more sensitized and take it more seriously and respond more professionally than what we see now. For example, disaster tourism, media coverage. Disaster tourism is something I crowned when I was interviewed by CNN, and it was taken up as a cliche that people go out to take pictures while the event is unfolding. And with the advent of social media, it even becomes worse. So all those aspects impact negatively on our ability to mitigate and to respond adequately. And that we have to set a program in place so that we can educate and have that culture change towards disaster management and response.
All right. What we're going to do here is take a look at the latest disaster. This time we're talking about Guyana. And the situation there is such, and I can share with you exactly what's happening. This particular production provided by the Government Information Service in Guyana. And this is President Irfan Ali on a grand tour of the developments. And in fact, he was most unhappy with some of the developments there.
These pumps are critical in ensuring there is a quick flow of water off the land. During the late-night inspection, the head of state discovered that the pumps at Riverview were off, the coker doors were closed, and the worker was asleep.
We understand that this is a national emergency, and we're responding to it that way. But it cannot be a national irresponsibility. Tonight I decided to check all the pumps because a lot has been said. The mayor came out and blamed the government. We made it very clear that the government has made the investment in the pumps and all the facilities. You have the fuel and everything. And here is it, the pump is not working. The pump is turned off.
The pumps at Lombard Street and Kitty were also turned off. Following the visit by the president, the pumps were subsequently turned on. Meanwhile, over at the Civil Defense Commission, Director General Lieutenant Colonel Kester Craig said most regions have been severely affected, with the exception of regions 1.
All right, so there you got then a good sense of what's happening there in Guyana. Not a happy situation for the president to go out and find that some of the pumps are turned off, and the people who should be looking after the pumps and making sure that those gates are opened, etc., asleep at the wheel. Not a happy situation, Don.
Exactly my point. So we need to go back to the drawing boards and make disaster management and disaster response mitigation a very serious aspect of our development. We shouldn't be able to afford to have people sleeping at the pumps and not having the matters as addressed by the president not attended to. You're talking about lives, you're talking about investments, you're talking about sustainability. So we need to be on top of our game, and that's what I want to appeal to those of us who are watching in the public or who are in charge of any institution that plays a part in the mitigation, in the response, in the cycle, the management cycle. Should take that disaster management seriously. And what I was trying to say is the comprehensive disaster management strategy from CDEM was intended to do just that, to mainstream disaster risk management, resilience building, sustainability in all sectors of our development process, whether it be at the civil society, at the NGO level, at the public service level, at the private sector level. If we can get that mainstream in our development processes, then we will see a change of that kind of culture that we have, laid back, not taking things seriously, only reacting when an event is upon us or has struck us. We need to change that concept, and the only way we can change it is through human behavior.
Don Corriet is a former coordinator of disaster management in Rosa Dominica. He's with us here on Caribbean Bridges. Also joining me, Regis Chapman, who is head of the World Food Program for the Caribbean. He's in Bridgetown, Barbados. I want to give Regis an opportunity to talk more about the World Food Program. But specifically, Regis, am I correct in describing your work as not just you talk about the innovative matters or approach to the Caribbean region as such. And I was thinking here that you're not just here now to deliver food, but maybe there's an aspect of it that is really related to our whole planning for food to service in an emergency.
That's right. And the World Food Program, I mean, our name sort of says a lot, right, about what we do. But the World Food Program has also changed significantly over the last decade or so. And in addition to providing food in kind, we actually provide a lot of cash-based transfers. And I think this is particularly important in the context of the Caribbean, where, in the immediate aftermath of a major emergency, food supplies may be scarce and difficult to come by, and bringing in food is the most appropriate solution. But at the same time, as you move onwards and markets start to re-emerge and open, providing cash transfers to people gives them greater flexibility to meet the needs that they have, and rather than myself or a government deciding what it is they think people need, empowering them to make their own choices is really the best way to go in times of an emergency. So what we do in the Caribbean, we're working on a couple of fronts. So one, we recognize that again, when a major emergency happens, that food is a critical need, food and water, and we do everything that we can to make sure that people have access to food. And sometimes that involves bringing food into a country, but oftentimes that also involves bringing our emergency response capacities in logistics and assessments and organizing communities and running distribution safely, and helping governments in the Caribbean deliver what they have, either what they're purchasing or what neighboring islands have sent in, or other private donations and unsolicited goods and other things that come in. And I think, Don touched on a few aspects of SEDEMA and the regional response mechanisms. And really, I think this is something extremely unique about the Caribbean. And for SIDS, you can't have every capacity that you would like in every country. And obviously a country like Jamaica, where there's much larger population and perhaps greater capacities, whereas on the far other end you would have a Montserrat, which again, you can't expect Montserrat to have access to the same response capacities that a Jamaica would have. It's inevitable. So where SEDIMA comes in is really to bring the power of the Caribbean as a whole together to respond to emergencies when they happen. And that includes, the sexy ones, as you said, Julian, the big hurricanes, but also St. Vincent, what's going on right now. And if the situation in Guyana continues to worsen and there's a need for broader regional and international support, those mechanisms are there to do that. And I think really it's quite important to reflect on, I always say a united Caribbean is a stronger Caribbean. And I think that's very much true, not just when the emergencies hit and when you're in response mode, but also in that preparedness mode and understanding which countries and territories around the Caribbean can offer what when an emergency happens. And so that planning side also needs to take that into account.
I want to move you gentlemen to the matter of resilience, because of course that is if I may say so, the sexy word in the response to what's happened in this region in recent years. And I come back to you, Don, because obviously you have a prime minister who went to the United Nations and encouraged the whole world community to recognize not only the required support, not just for Dominica, but for all the region affected by those devastating hurricanes. But you boasted that you'd want to build back better. Now, since Maria, can you say you've built back better? Can you be specific and tell us exactly what has happened in housing, agriculture, infrastructure, etc.?
Yeah, in terms of housing, I think the government is doing a pretty good job in providing adequate infrastructural housing for the people affected by Tropical Storm Erika in the first instance, and Hurricane Maria, and as a general policy. We think, notwithstanding the gaps or some of the quarrels and some of the concerns being raised, legitimate concerns in terms of procurement, in terms of environmental impact studies, the housing component seemed to be meeting its objective, because a lot of persons who have received housing are very satisfied. They seem to be structurally sound, and they are meeting their purpose. In terms of other infrastructural development, roads seem to be being constructed in taking more engineering into concern, taking water movement into concern, for example. So we see bridges being reinforced or replaced. We see drains, storm drains being built. So there's a sense that in the infrastructural domain that we are making some strides. We are making some great strides. Complements the housing ministry and the donors who have pledged and who have supported that initiative. In terms of the people, the population, we still have a lot of work to be done. I know the ODM and the local government, for example, which that ministry is responsible for community disaster programs. They have a lot of programs being initiated to strengthen resilience at the house level, at the community level, and that those programs are ongoing. I can't remember the name of the recent one, but there's a CERT program, for example, Community Emergency Response Teams, that we are trying to, when I say we, no longer a member of ODM, but I consider we being part of the process. And if I need to encourage people, I'll do that. That we need to instill in people the emergency response, the team building, the resilience aspect. So we're continuing to do that good work. And also in agriculture, we're seeing some very good programs going through agriculture. We're getting more crop resistant plants and methods of growing crops. We see a shift to greenhousing production, for example. In the area of animal husbandry, we're seeing the same thing. A program led by the World Bank or financed by the World Bank is on stream. So there are a lot of positives coming out from our resilient building. We still have ways ahead for wanting to become, in my opinion, the first ever resilient country in the world. We still have a lot more to go, and as I said, we need to instill that resilient building aspect at the individual level and the community level. Plenty more work to do, a lot more work to be done in that area. But I think we are on the right track, barring you have concerns, but barring the concerns, I think we are on the right track in building back better. We see domestic housing, for example, people are reinforcing, we are taking mitigation steps to drain their property, to protect their property from slides, building retaining walls. The soft resilient aspects, like trying to get insurance that is affordable, in group insurance, for example. So we see all those matters coming to the fore in our Resilience Building Back Better program.
I have to ask you, Don, because I know we showed pictures of government-led housing projects, and I wanted to ask you about the matter of the important building codes in the private sector.
Well, that's some of the concerns being raised by certain sectors of the society, that whether the building codes are being adhered to, whether planning permission is being given in a formal form, whether the areas located or selected for housing is appropriate, given EIA is not being forthcoming or not being readily available. Barring that, as I said, the structures seem to be sound. The mitigation around the buildings seem to be working okay. There are concerns in areas where apartments have been built, considered swampland, but then you have to take the mitigation aspects into consideration. It's going to be costly, but it has to be done if you want to sustain that kind of project. There was concern, for example, when we talk about resilience, the location, for example, of the Petit Savane relocation housing scheme. And some of us were of the opinion that the location was not the best if we're talking about resilience, because it was at the foot of one of the most active volcanic centers on island. And if you recall, a few years back, Dr. Shepard from the SRC had recommended to the governments at the time that critical infrastructure should not be built in the volcanic zone. We should try to shift our development for sustainability outside of the zones that have been clearly demarcated by volcanic seismic maps. So that is probably a negative that we still see a focus of building critical infrastructure. For example, the New China Friendship Hospital is located within the volcanic zone. The stadium is located within the volcanic zone. So if we're trying to be a resilient nation, we have to take on board the recommendations coming from the experts, the recommendation coming from the scientists, and to coexist with that kind of recommendation and look at decentralizing our development in less hazardous areas on the island. Excuse me. We saw examples of what happened to Montserrat and Plymouth. Plymouth was decimated and will not be habitable for another 50, 100 years probably. Is the same thing likely to happen to Roseau, given that we are surrounded by 6 active volcanoes? One never knows. But what we have in our control is the fact that we can plan around those hazards, those potential hazards. And if they should become disasters, that we have planned in such a way that some of our critical infrastructure are placed outside that zone. So for continuity, we can sustain our nation. For example, in the Ministry of Technology, I was kind of skeptical about us putting our major hub and backup hub in the same general location, probably about 3, 4, 5 miles apart. If one goes by let's say a seismic or volcanic activity, both goes. That kind of planning we need to fine tune. One should be in let's say the capital city, and another one outside of the red zone, so that if we have some kind of impact, that we have continuity. So these are kind of the resilience things I would like to see. But there are concerns, I must say, there are concerns coming from the private sector construction persons. I am not a part of the studies that were done by them. I cannot speak to it, but from what I'm hearing, some of the infrastructure could be better placed or better designed to meet the objectives of our resilient island, so to speak.
Don, you're teaching me something there about Dominica. I didn't realize about the volcanic location around Roseau, and I was going to ask you about the construction in the vicinity of the Roseau River there, so that you don't have a repetition of what happened during Maria, where the river literally come down and wipe everybody out there.
Yeah, well, again, mitigation plans include building a river wall that could seem to want to control that happening in the future. But again, we have to be mindful that, excuse me, we have to be mindful that a hazard is a hazard, and a flooding hazard for the city of Roseau is real. And no two flooding situations may be the same. And we saw what happened in Maria, and we saw what happened in Erica. And we need to move people away. For example, we need to have buffer zones around the rivers. We need to have buffer zones around the coastline so that we can prevent the impact that we saw in some of the hazards or the disasters that we face recently. Some of the steps to be taken has to be driven, for example, by the Ministry of Planning or the Planning Department. Some people of the opinion that they do not have teeth, or they do not have the fortitude to do it. Some are criticizing, for example, that government doesn't have the political will because they do not want to upset too much of the population that may lead to disenfranchisement or certain dissatisfaction that we may eventually lose whatever support. But if we need to be serious about resilient building, we have to bite the bullet. We have to make decisions that are not popular. We have to take decisions that are in the best interest of the overall population.
I want to bring Regis in here because, of course, obviously resilience is in the World Food Program vocabulary as well. You've been around long enough in this region to better understand what those requirements are. Would you speak to us on that?
There's a few things I'd like to say about resilience. I think, one, in the Caribbean, there tends to be a lot of emphasis on infrastructure, and it's critical, and all of what Don mentioned, in addition to things like, burying electric cables, there's a whole plethora of things that can be done from an infrastructure perspective. As the World Food Program, we take a very people-focused approach to things as well, and I think, the whole issue of sustainable livelihoods and the ability of people to have resilience at their own household level is something that perhaps needs a little bit more attention. COVID-19, as everyone here knows, has had significant economic repercussions on the region, and that shows in the people that are most vulnerable in society. The World Food Program has been working with the CARICOM Secretariat on a series of COVID-19 food security and livelihoods impact surveys. And really what we've seen is that the crisis has continued to impact people who are the poorest, and it's impacted them the heaviest. So they have less ability to cope with such events, and you can exchange COVID for a major hurricane or a volcanic eruption or flooding or anything that disrupts your livelihoods, but their ability to cope and manage in the face of disaster is just inadequate. And so there needs to be, I think, a real re-emphasis on how do we bring people out of poverty? How do we create more sustainable livelihoods for people, as well as looking at the infrastructure? Now, the other thing I'd like to say about resilience, and I think this is a rather unique, well, it's not a unique thing only to the Caribbean, but I think SIDS have a rather unique take on this, and that's fiscal vulnerability and fiscal space, or lack thereof, of many governments in the region. You know, the challenge of being labeled an upper middle income country or a high income country has significant repercussions on a country's ability to access grants, to access concessional financing, and you know, every government in the Caribbean is extremely reliant on loans, and servicing the debt each year is a significant part of a government's budget. So, you know, the ability to put in place all these mechanisms to build a more resilient society is very much hampered by the fiscal space, or again, the lack thereof, that many governments around the region have. I think there's a lot that's happening in the Caribbean that's bringing more attention to this. There's work between the United Nations systems and the Caribbean Development Bank on defining a new vulnerability index, and the idea would be that such an index would also help to inform eligibility for different types of finances, for example. And many of the prime ministers around the region speak very passionately about this topic. And you know, I think what we've seen is in many countries, you know, as debt increases and the ability to access other types of funding reduces, what we've seen is a stall in development. And I think countries, you know, trajectory towards achieving the SDGs in 2030 is constrained by these issues. So you have a stagnation in development, you have a stagnation in economic growth, you have you know, challenges for governments to be able to invest in what they want to be able to invest in, what they know they need to invest in, but at the same time that you can only do with what you have. So you know, there really needs to be, I think, a look at how do we you know, address some of these financing issues. And I know that there are a number of things that are happening. So one example is within the region, which is a model for much of the world, is the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, or the CRIF SPC. And this is a rather unique instrument in the region, which again, in like any insurance, when you're paying for it and don't need it, it seems a waste of money. But when you need it and you're not paying for it, you realize its importance. And I think there needs to be perhaps more innovative thinking around debt relief and debt swaps to really allow governments to have this fiscal space. And if you look at, you know, the current situation as it's been classified in, say, 2020, you know, by international financial institutions, the economic situation, you know, post 2020 and post COVID is significantly worse for a number of countries in the region. But yet, because labeled an upper middle income or a high income country, again, the ability to access different types of financing is constrained. And I think this is a real challenge for the region, and something that the world needs to think about. You had mentioned before Prime Minister Skerritt's speech to the UN General Assembly. I think it was a matter of days after Hurricane Maria. And he made a very important point. You know, his point was that it's not the Caribbean producing these greenhouse gases, and you know, it's not the Caribbean that's contributing massively to pollution and overfishing. It's not the Caribbean that's moving that needle of climate change, but it is the region that's suffering quite significantly from the impacts of climate change. So again, I think there needs to be really a rethink in the global scheme of things about the value that SIDS add to the world, and how we protect that value.
Now, in the remaining moments, I want to ask both of you gentlemen to talk to the NGO communities. I know that Don is head of Red Cross in Dominica and also the Cancer Society. Where do you find the time, Don?
Yeah, I make the time. I spent 12 hours almost, let's say on average 10 hours for the public service while I was at the airport as a air traffic controller and as an airport manager, and in the disaster office, the same thing. You never have a 8 to 4 moment. So I have worked long days, so I factor in, and now I have a bit of time, so I split my time between the Dominica Red Cross, the Dominica Cancer Association, my domestic pepper sauce industry, and a little farming here and there. So I find the time. But what was the specific question?
I just thought you might want to take the
Oh,
opportunity.
the NGOs, yeah. So, for example, yes. I'm not the head of the Red Cross in Dominica, for just a correction. I'm a member of the board of directors. Okay. And similarly, we do a lot of community work, and our emphasis is at the grassroots level, trying to empower communities to be resilient, providing resources, providing training, because we are important cog in the wheel when it comes to disaster planning, preparedness, mitigation, response, and rehabilitation. We did some work in renovating houses post Maria, and we continue to do training and at the community level in first aid and CPR and triaging, and we do that for the CDRT, the Community Disaster Response Team, similar to what the Office of Disaster Management throughout the Caribbean do for CIT, the Community Emergency Response Teams. So I think the NGOs have a critical role to play in the whole scheme of things when it comes to building resilience and in planning and mitigation and response. So that's what I can say about the Red Cross. Similarly, we have a challenge for getting funding for our programs as the national, as does the organization at the national level. I know CDMA, for example, would be assisting the Office of Disaster Management through their direct country assistance program. That is a competitive area for funding, and your projects have to be on time, in tune, for you to be able to grasp that funding. But on the NGO level, I think the role is critical, and we continue to play that very important role.
And Regis, I know you've been there, so you can talk about that as well.
Yeah, obviously, local NGOs, the Red Cross movement, civil society as a whole is critical for resilience and has to play a role. I think one of the challenges we see in the Caribbean when it comes to the response side, though, is that oftentimes there's a large number of new NGOs that either form at the local level or come in from outside, and I think that can actually constrain a little bit of response. And one of the things we saw, for example, in the Bahamas in 2019 is the number of actors and the amount of unsolicited items that came into that context was, that was the disaster within the disaster, trying to deal with all these unsolicited items. And I think we've talked about the systems and the coordination mechanisms in SEDIMA, the role of the national disaster management authorities, and the Caribbean does have structures and systems for disaster management, and sometimes they're implemented more to the letter than in other instances. But I think I guess I would encourage some of the NGO community to make sure that when events do happen and the good that they want to do, that they look at how do they make sure that that's contributing to the national efforts. And obviously, if you're in a very local community area and your desire and your heart is in that community, right? But at the same time, there needs to be a bit of command and control, for lack of a better description, in an emergency response. And I think the more that actors are coordinating and working with those leading the response, the better off the overall response is.
And as I listen to you, Regis, I have the picture of what's happened just recently in St. Vincent with their port literally clogged, and also the experience of Dominica after Maria, where there was so much stuff coming in that itself was a logistical nightmare. I'm sure you remember that, Don.
Yep. Yeah, it can be, and it's something that you can't avoid, you cannot plan for sometimes. In the case of St. Vincent, the volcanic eruption, Like these pictures I saw, almost, well, it put a spoke in the wheel of the car that everything came to a halt, because that's the dynamics of such hazards, like volcanoes. But one of the other challenges, though, for NGOs and even at the national level is volunteerism. Volunteers seem to be drying up. People are less inclined to volunteer now, and that's one of the big challenges for us at the Red Cross, getting volunteers on a sustained basis. We get during an event, or we see a lot of people propping up wanting to help, but once we go back now into the calm or the peacetime, we see them figuring out. But that is the people we want to maintain and to train, so that they can impact the train, transfer of knowledge, transfer of information, transfer of technology, and there is a challenge right there. So we're trying to strategize on how best we can keep volunteers together. The idea of incentives, monetary and otherwise, there's a cost, and then again you go back to square one, where funds for such activities are drying up, or being very competitive. But yes, the impacts of a volcanic eruption, Maria. Look at Maria, for example, on Dominica. 200% of GDP. How does an island, even if you want to be the first resilient island, how does an island recover from that without outside partnerships and help, such as the World Food Program, UNDP, CARICOM, ODM, CDMA, and other agencies? How does an island impacted like Montserrat, without the British being its head of the colony? How does an island like Montserrat recover from such an impact? So yeah, we're going to have some serious challenges, and it's forecast that the hazards are going to be more intense. Well, not the hazards, but the events coming out from the hazards are going to be more intense, especially hydromet events. and so we have to prepare ourselves for the inevitable.
I think you've hit quite a very important matter there in terms of volunteerism, and the other, of course, is donations. And Eric, I'll give you a chance to make an appeal to donate services, donate money. How does it work? Regis.
Can I tap you, Regis?
Yes.
So I think, please go ahead.
Regis, go ahead.
Sure. No, I think, again, people want to support, and you see these things on the news, and it breaks your heart to see the way people suffer when these events happen. And again, anyone who's been through any of these events, much more so. I think, the best thing that people can do to support is to support recognized entities. So, in every emergency I've been involved with in the Caribbean, governments create bank accounts that diaspora and others can send contributions to in cash. The United Nations will often launch an appeal. SEDEMA, will often launch an appeal. The Red Cross movement will often launch an appeal. And I think, rather than packing some things in a blue barrel and sending it, to the impacted country, or businesses that pack containers full of bottled water and things that can typically be purchased either in the affected state or in a nearby state, or can be done in a more sustainable way, the better. So, cash is really the best way to go. Find an organization or an entity that you trust, or the government themselves, and donate through those appropriate channels, and donate in cash, and let the experts that do these things and do the procurement and do it in bulk and meet the needs of the entire population that's impacted. Let them do it in the way that they're designed to do their job. Many of us, and Don had mentioned challenges for resources. The World Food Program were 100% voluntarily funded. In the Caribbean, when emergency strikes, we typically are able to get some resources from our traditional donors. So USAID, the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, ECHO, the European Union's humanitarian wing, Canada, etc. Several partners, traditionally support the World Food Program, and that support's critical. We do, depending on the event, receive private individual contributions from communities in Europe or in North America or elsewhere, and other sources of private sector contributions. But again, it's not just the World Food Program. There are several actors out there that know how to do the job that they are meant to do when an emergency happens, from the government themselves to the UN system and regional entities.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for
Julian, if I
giving
may
us a
just
window into this. Don, yes, quick word.
I just wanted to plug a quick word. One of our serious challenges is psychosocial support post-event.
Fair enough. That
is one of the areas we have to strengthen. That
certainly is a good one.
Yeah,
gentlemen, time is against us. Gentlemen, time is against us, but I want to thank you very much for giving us a window into your world and how we can best help this Caribbean survive and thrive. Thank you very much. I'm Julian Rogers in Kingston, and this is Caribbean Bridges.